Well, hello everybody and welcome to Trending Treasury, our weekly webcast that we've been now running for well over 60 episodes. Hopefully you're all used to the format. This week we're going to be talking to my good friend and colleague David Green about the CIPFA Prudential Code Consultation. Many of you will remember back in February. The consultation was issued, looking at some quite significant changes to the Prudential Code. We've now had CIPFA's sort of first go at giving us a response and their sort of responses to the consultation and how they expect things to go forward. So David's going to give us the benefit of his expertise and go through some of the things that CIPFA have said, the directions we expect it to go in, and what the impact could be. So David, thanks very much for joining us. So how are you? You've been enjoying the very strange weather we're having in the south this last couple of weeks?
Yes, it's been great, hasn't it? Well, I think I'm in the east now rather than the south. So yeah, we seem to get all the same weather as you get in London, but about an hour later. It's quite nice to get the sort of preview of what's going to happen when the rain's coming and the like.
Yeah, it's been a bit strange. It's especially strange for me when I talk to friends in the north of England and in North Wales, saying that they've had fantastic weather and I'm sat in what feels like a monsoon. So to crack on and to get going, just to give as a way of a little bit of background for our listeners, I think most people will be relatively confident they know what the Prudential Code is. But if we rewind back to February, what were some of the main areas that CIPFA were looking to consult on?
Yeah, I think there were several areas. There was the Prudential Code and the Treasury Management Code. But I think this is the key bit really. This authorities must not borrow more than or in advance of their needs purely in order to profit from investment to the extra sums borrowed. And I think when this first came out, the Prudential Code has been around since 2004. And it's had this line in it, and it was initially meant, don't borrow above the CFR, reduce rates from PWB, and then reinvest it in cash deposits, I guess. And there were times, you could borrow from PWB at 4% and get 5% in the bank. Back in the good old days, I guess. Obviously, since then, short-term rates have fallen dramatically. PWB rates are higher. The government's added about 0.6 or so to the cost of borrowing from PWB. So you wouldn't do that, no one's going to borrow extra from PWB just to leave it in cash anymore. But what has happened over time is local authorities have invested a lot of money in commercial property, and I guess a few other things like solar bonds. So somehow CIPFA management have sort of rephrased the meaning of this. So the need is no longer the CFR apparently, and the need to borrow is sort of how much cash you need to run the organisation and provide services. Borrowing to invest in property or something else is now seen as bad. But it's never been very clear from the Prudential Code that's what they mean. It's only never really defined need anything other than CFR.
And from memory, that was one of our sort of bits of feedback originally, that the original consultation document wanted to really sort of play around at the edges on borrowing in advance of need. Is it purely, or is it primarily? Is it without defining some of these things? And the example you gave then was really useful. Well, what does mean? They never really defined what need meant. Was it liability benchmark? Was it CFR? So it seems to me, and maybe I'm over optimistic and you're going to shoot me down in flames, David, but it seems to me that they've actually taken on board a lot of feedback on that, because they've really changed what the actual, if we look at that line, that box there, what the consultation said, they've really basically torn that up and given us something a bit more, I don't want to say useful, but certainly a lot more direct.
Well, a lot more clarity, certainly. I think no one can be in any doubt what CIPFA's intentions are and what the code is saying. So I guess there's two parts. It replaces that must not borrow more in advance of needs, and it now lists a number of reasons where you can borrow. So to finance capital expenditure for service purposes, to cut off interest rate risk, so to borrow in advance to manage the risk of future rates going up on already approved expenditure, or for cash flow purposes, and to refinance existing debt, or to externalise internal borrowing, where that's for providing services. So like if you kind of reduce reserves, that increases, reduces your capacity to internally borrow, increases the need to externally borrow. So that's all fine. And then they've sort of listed some areas here on the bottom of this page that you can't borrow. So authority must not borrow for the primary purpose of commercial return. And we've not seen the guidance that specifies what a commercial return means yet, but clearly it's anything where return is the main objective, I think. So treasury management, security, liquidity trump yield, but for commercial investment, yield tends to trump everything else, or at least it's a much bigger input. You don't ignore risk in any investment, but something where you're willing to take on high risk to gain a high return. I think property is the key example of that. So they've gone on, not prudent for local authorities to make any investment or spending decision that will increase the CFR. So it's not just borrowing to invest, it's increasing the CFR to invest, given that that could well lead to further borrowing in the future. And then they've got this rather strange line at the bottom. These principles apply to prudential borrowing for capital financing, fine, such as externalising internal borrowing for primary purpose of commercial return. And that just seems odd, because externalising internal borrowing is not prudential borrowing for capital financing. So they're sort of two separate things, but maybe they just mean and.
Yeah, it seems quite strange to me, because whether, as you put it, capital financing is all the nice things with CFR and MRP and all of those sorts of things, and where you actually fund that capital financing from, the borrowing element is a bit of a treasury management decision, and you'd think that that part seems quite separate to capital financing. Whether it's a capital receipt you use or what your capital financing approach is, does seem slightly different, perhaps. It seems like it's quite well, as you put it, the clarity is there. But when we say, for the primary purpose of commercial return, do we think that CIPFA are trying to stop clients and stop local authorities from making investments where there's a service purpose, but they also make a return, or where a service investment, a regeneration project, for example? I think over the next 5 years we're going to see a lot of regeneration projects. Do we think that CIPFA, but if those regeneration projects, in parlance, wash their face, if they fund themselves, or perhaps even fund, create a return greater than their cost, are CIPFA trying to stop that sort of thing?
No, and there's some extra text they've proposing that sort of covers that. So anything where it's clearly a service objective and it happens to make money as a sort of secondary, as a side benefit. So I think it's going to be too clear. I think in people's capital programs, they're going to need to be very clear primary purpose for anything where the sort of borderline. Be clear the primary purpose is for regeneration or for other service aspects. So I don't think there's any problem with making money, as long as making money is not the primary goal. Clearly, it's much easier to do that for something in borough than it is for outside.
And so, with all that in mind, it seems that it's a pretty clear, piece of a clear document of what the code is going to end up looking like. But I was flicking through the code last night to the consultation document, last night to reacquaint myself with some of the points before today, and I came around this idea that the code is going to introduce this objective around commercial investment, that we're going to have a sort of good practice for commercial investment. But if I read and discuss what we've just discussed, it seems that commercial investment is slightly off the table. So first of all, it doesn't sound like CIPFA are saying sell all your commercial property, number one, if they're giving you objectives around it. And two, it seems to be an admission almost that some projects which don't have yield as their primary objective may need to be managed in a commercial and sensible manner. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think there's two things on there. There's existing commercial investments, however they've been found, whether they've been funded through borrowing in recent years or they're long-standing commercial investments. So they need managing properly. So there's seems to be no problem with spending money on existing properties to keep them up to scratch. And in CIPFA's view, they appear to be happy for you to sell commercial property and use that capital receipt to buy new commercial property. We'll see later that that's not always the case for other guidance, but in there, because that won't increase the CFR, which is CIPFA's main worry, and it won't need borrowing. So that's fine. And then of course I think it's good the Prudential Code's got to allow for the local authorities who don't borrow. There are authorities who are debt free, or have too much borrowing, so they've got a lot of cash ready, so they don't need any new borrowing. And for those people, it should be fine for them to invest the money they've already got. So I think people aren't worried about local authorities investing their own money in property or anything else for a yield. It's the gearing up, it's borrowing to invest is the issue. So there doesn't seem to be any problem with managing existing portfolios of property, or indeed with people who are cash rich naturally without borrowing for them to invest in anything. Yeah, it's an interesting situation. We've had quite a lot of questions already. So I think before we move on to sort of our next plan section, probably a good idea just to jump right in rather than taking them all at the end. Bit of a specific question, but I think it's an interesting one as a general principle, which is that if you have a local authority that owns land which industrial units could be built on, previously you had the option that you could sell the land to a developer and they could do all of that, or you could borrow some money and build units on them yourself and retain the assets in-house. I suppose the question is, do local authorities no longer have that second option to do things themselves, or is it a little bit more complicated now? It feels like it's a bit more complicated. Yes, I think so. I think if this land is in the borough, district, county, in the boundaries of the local authority, I think there's an argument that it's a service investment, providing employment opportunities for local people. And regeneration and all of those other things, economic. I mean, we'll move on to talking about some of the similarities and differences between the Public Works Loan Board and the CIPFA Code later, but I think a big one for me seems to be that for the Treasury and for the DMO, it was certainly they were pretty explicit that sort of economic redevelopment was to be encouraged. It wasn't that the idea was not to discourage those sorts of ideas. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, so I think broadly everyone's happy with things in borough that are going to increase employment opportunities or just make it look nicer. I guess there's an argument whether a nice green field turning it into factories is good, but I don't think anyone argues about brownfield sites. I mean, the next question we've got, I think, is quite an interesting one as well, which is, when the code says that the primary purpose is commercial return, does this include investments into the CCLA property fund? Well, I think it could do, couldn't it? I mean, we would say that's going to be a treasury management investment normally, so it doesn't increase the CFR, so it doesn't lead to new borrowing. I guess it might be caught by the final bullet point there, externalising internal borrowing, primary purpose of commercial return, only if you are actually, borrowing to do that. But I think you'd be investing in CIPFA property fund as a sort of security, liquidity, yield type approach. And I think principally is how you define security. And if for a long-term investment, keeping your money secure involves keeping pace with the rate of inflation, so you're maintaining the purchasing power investment. Therefore, you need to do something sort of yield generative to do that. So, you know, there could be some borderline activities there, I guess. And we'll probably wait to see exactly what the final code says. But certainly would be pushing for some, you know, the types of investments people make that are not capital expenditure, normally be treasury management type investments, and certainly really capital things, I think, should be included. Something to watch out for, certainly.
Yeah, and there's another interesting one that we've received, which is I think comes back to earlier points in earlier conversations we've had, which is this raises a similar question that we all asked of the Public Works Loan Board consultation, which is what about capital expenditure that's required to preserve the value of existing commercial assets? Now, I know we've had a pretty clear steer and you know, an explicit response from the Public Works Loan Board that says you can make capital expenditure to maintain commercial assets. But what about the draft code? Is that quiet on this, or does it give us a steer as well?
Yeah, I certainly don't think CIPFA is trying to stop that. You know, we don't want sort of local authority owned buildings falling into disrepair. People going, well, you know, we're not allowed to repair this building. Sorry, the framework doesn't allow us to do it. So if it's not already clear, I'm sure the final code will be. They're sort of quite keen on things like that. I mean, it would increase the CFR potentially, wouldn't it? So, and it's not directly related to the functions of the activity. So it does need a clause to exempt it, certainly.
So perhaps that's the sort of area, that sort of clarification that we might see clients wanting to make to CIPFA and wanting to make to in their responses and in their conversations. You know, that sort of, well, we need you've given us sort of the broad approach, but we do actually need something specific.
Indeed, yes. So CIPFA has committed to sort of a second round consultation where it will have the final text of the code. There's quite a lot of it in this consultation response issued out in last month in June, but certainly expecting a sort of very full consultation on the exact wording of the new code pretty soon as well.
And just before we do move on, there's one last one which I think will be very easy to answer, which is what about funding green projects from the Public Works Loan Board? Somewhere down the line they will generate yield. Well, I think we've already answered that question sort of at the beginning, which was when we said, you know, this consultation is not trying to stop you from investing and making in you know, your local area, in doing things that, you know, are service related or policy related that then happen to make a profit. It's all about, you know, if you're undertaking green investment because, you know, it's a policy priority of the authority, it's very different to, you know, investing and then that makes profit. That's very different to investing purely or primarily or any nice words that CIPFA may have given up on for yield. So if we sort of move on to some of the differences. I mean, we've mentioned and we've had a comment around the Public Works Loan Board lending terms. What are some of the differences and similarities between the proposed wording and the Public Works Loan Board and indeed MHCLG's guidance as well? Yeah,
I think the key difference really is, so CIPFA and CLG are worried about people borrowing to invest. And you know, CIPFA is clear that borrowing includes increasing the CFR, which may later need to externalise internal borrowing. Whereas the PWB is very much, the Treasury have taken the view that we won't just ban borrowing for a project, because we know that local authorities could, you know, if we've got some capital receipts, we could fund our service investments from capital receipts and then borrow for commercial property, or we could switch them around. We could say, well, okay, we won't do that then if that's not allowed. We'll borrow for the service project and we'll use our capital receipts on the commercial investment. So Treasury and PWB were therefore keen to cut off capital expenditure on new properties entirely. And that doesn't just stop you borrowing for that project, that would stop you borrowing for any purpose. So it's quite a severe penalty for falling foul of PLB rules. Although it doesn't stop you borrowing from elsewhere. But we think the appetite for private sector lenders to lend to local authorities will be diminished if they don't have access to PLB. So there's a danger there. Whereas CIPFA and CLG are much more about borrowing. But then, of course, they haven't got many penalties for it. In fact, the CLG says you must not borrow more than what's needed purely to profit from investments unborrowed. So copy to the Prudential Code wording as it exists now. And then it says, but if you do that, then you must explain why you're doing it. That's the strategy. Which I guess is that's a standard thing. So both CIPFA and CLG codes are statutory guidance, so they're not the law. You don't have to follow them, but the law requires you to have regard to the guidance, and that's generally meant following it unless you've got a good reason not to, and then you have to document to explain that good reason why you're not following it. So CLG is really just sort of underlining that, how guidance works.
I mean, on that, I mean, I thought it did amuse me that that CIPFA will be putting into the code the status of the code to tell us, what the code is and why it exists, which I thought was a bit belt and braces, if you ask me.
Yes, yeah. It is interesting. The legislation for England, certainly, I can't remember all the others off the top of my head, but in England it says you have to have regard to the Prudential Code when setting the authorised limit, the affordable borrowing limit, which I guess that's the only direct need to have regard to the code. But clearly, how you set that limit depends on your plans being prudent, affordable, and sustainable, etc. So it rolls out to the wider code, I think, but it is quite a narrow requirement to have regard to the Prudential Code at the minute. That could all change, of course.
One area that was, I think, controversial, would be fair to say, in both the Treasury Management Code and the Prudential Code Consultation was questions over climate change. There was a suggestion in the Treasury Code that there would be an ESG Treasury management practice. Now that's been knocked on the head, but it's sort of its fellow in the Prudential Code around sustainability with regard to climate change doesn't seem to have gone the same way. And it seems that although there was a lot of, I think it's fair to say, negative feedback about putting this into the code, CIPFA are pushing ahead with it. They've talked about additional direction. It seems to me that this is, and maybe this is me, being a little bit too siloed in my thinking, but it doesn't feel like it's a very, that seems like it's a very much a policy question rather than an area for this sort of guidance. And how is CIPFA going to square that? They can't, it's not their job to tell local authorities how seriously to take these things. So what direction do you think that will end up going in?
Yeah, I think it's a, frameworks do adapt. ESG is becoming more relevant to particularly investment. I think it's difficult to apply ESG to borrowing. I was having discussions with someone actually. Well, actually, if you borrow from someone who's got bad ESG credentials, that could be a good thing. You're diverting their resources into good things you're going to do, and away from something bad they might do themselves. But of course, it's not usually such clear cut as to what's a good and bad. Fossil fuel is the ideal. BP, Shell, etc. They are some of the biggest investors in clean energy, but they're also some of the biggest creators of fossil fuels. So they're bad, but are moving in the right direction. So it's difficult. For CIPFA, I mean, it was bad choice of words for use sustainability for climate change. Code already talks about prudent, affordable, and sustainable being key objectives. Sustainable meaning financial sustainability. So they certainly need to be clear if they're going to start using sustainability to mean climate change instead. And you're right, there's a lot of feedback that's not CIPFA's role to set service objectives for local authorities. But I think they are keen to make the framework work for it. So people say, well, I can't look at ESG risk because the code doesn't mention it. I've only got to look at security, liquidity, and yield, and ESG's got to be a fourth or fifth consideration. I think by bringing that in, particularly to the Treasury Code, as a part of the risk management agenda, without it being an overall riding thing, means people can use it more within maybe it's security, liquidity, ESG, and then yield or something. Bring it in somewhere in the framework. But it's not a fully developed idea yet, and different people have got different ideas of what's ethical, sustainable, etc. So it's a new area. I don't think CIPFA are going to want to be too prescriptive in something that's new. Let it see how it pans out.
Yeah. So to finish off with, I think we've got one last slide, which is hot off the presses. I mean, I wasn't aware of this until recently. What MHCLG consultation? What's all this about, David? This is a new one on me.
Yeah, so something published late yesterday and popped into my inbox this morning. I think we were previously aware that the government was going to review its investment guidance and MRP guidance. Certainly, at the minute, the investment guidance copies parts of the Prudential Code, which are going to change. So it'll be wrong. So it clearly needs to be updated. But they've confirmed yesterday that they are going to consult during the summer. And it's a longish document, but it doesn't really give much away. It says they feel the whole framework is based on things like the Prudential Code and investment guidance, and that's up for CLG and CIPFA to write. It's then up to councils to implement that, and external audit has a role there, and then there's a role afterwards in what's actually happened, and then in scrutiny, including scrutiny from the press and the public in that. So it's all quite sort of wordy about how it works. But I picked out these 5 points that they're looking to do. Starting from the top, review their powers to cap local authorities' borrowing. So under what circumstances will they impose an authorised limit on a local authority? It's something is in the law at the minute, but something the government's never done. I guess they're looking to flesh out why they might do that, and not just for national economic reasons, but to maybe protect the local population. We know a couple of authorities that have borrowed £1 billion in recent years to make investments, and maybe that's something that should be government maybe should have acted earlier and capped those local authorities' ability to borrow to a lower amount. Number 2, updating their investment guidance to reinforce the new Prudential Code, so to make it consistent with it. So, and I guess it's increasingly becoming borrowing guidance as well as investment guidance, that document. So that will be not quite sure what else they can do really, apart from sort of copy the new paragraphs in the Prudential Code. Interesting. MRP I thought was interesting. Clarifying MRP guidance is one thing. Clearly they already did that in 2018, but clarify MRP regulations sounds interesting. So the regulations, the law currently says you have to have regard to the guidance, and that you have to make a prudent MRP. So I guess they could put the definition of prudent MRP in the legislation instead of in the guidance. And clearly this is in response to there's authorities being found to be making zero MRP, or to be charging MRP to capital instead of to revenue. No doubt some clarity on those areas will be forthcoming. So that's sort of the codes and the legislation, but now to borrow from PLB you have to fill in what used to be the certainty rate return, and now you have to categorise your capital expenditure in various categories. So they're looking to see who's categorising things in investment assets primarily for yield. That's one of the areas. Because then they want to intervene earlier where they see risks building. It's probably an acknowledgement that where people have borrowed £1 billion to invest, maybe government should have had a word earlier. But I think intervene sometimes is speak to the local authority and say, why are you doing this? You know, intervene's not necessarily take statutory action. Intervene is trying to understand, are members fully on board with what officers are doing? Certainly, I was looking at the webcast of a council meeting only yesterday, and one of the long-standing members asked the new Director of Finance, well, who approved this MRP policy? Well, you did, sir. Councillors have approved it. It might have been at the bottom of page 312 in the budget pack, but you approved it. I guess that speaks to some of the problems with government wanting so much stuff approved by full council. But that was CIPFA's idea with the capital strategy, was to have a very much summary document which gives the main points. So I think that's something we'll push back on government with all these requirements for large amounts of indicators and stuff to be approved by full council. Really, if you can get members to agree the summary, a 12-page document that everyone's going to read, much better, I think.
Well, I think as it's just gone 10:30, that's an excellent place to finish things, and an unexpected little extra at the end for our viewers. So thank you very much, David, for
thanks, Stephen.
Thank you very much for joining us. Just for our clients and viewers benefit, just to let you know, from next week is obviously the first full week of August. August tends to be a relatively quiet period as people have holidays and school holidays, and it's hopefully sunny, not overcast and horrible. So we're going to be doing something slightly different for the 4 weeks of August. We're going to be doing shorter sessions on a Thursday, so please do still keep us in your diary for 10 o'clock on a Thursday, but there'll be shorter 15-minute sessions with a member of the Island Close team, just covering a small element of Treasury. So we've got our colleague Laura Fallon next week, who will be presenting the first week. We've also going to have things looking at the Bank of England's MPC report. We're going to have some a short overview of some debt issues, so very much worth tuning in, but a shorter session because of the summer situation, but we hope you all still join us. So thank you all very much for joining us, and I'll just say thank you again to David for being as always an interesting and informative guest, and I hope you all have a good end of the day.